Hong Kong, like all societies and cultures, is steeped in contradictions. On the one hand, there have been startups, organizations, and coalitions of activists that have tried to draw attention to the issue of ethnic minority representation and justice over the last year. On the other hand, there has been a quiet, yet all too persistent black cloud in the Hong Kong government's relationships with its ethnic minority populations. General social prejudice and apathy for these groups, unreasonably high language barriers, and healthcare disparities. How can a region like Hong Kong, known widely as Asia's world city for its wide array of South Asian cultures and robust international commerce, reach a crossroads like this? And more importantly, what is being done to combat these inequities to its ethnic minority populations? To piece together how Hong Kong ended up at this precarious fork in the road, one would need to go back around 183 years to 1841. Under the Qing dynasty, Imperial China had just lost the First Opium War to Britain, resulting in the eventual ceding of Hong Kong to Britain. On August 29, 1842, Hong Kong was established as a crown colony of Britain, beginning the colonial period, further opening the city to international trade, influence, and crucially, wider immigration. Hong Kong would also face numerous developments throughout this period, such as the Hong Kong Island period, in which the Japanese occupation during World War II had dwindled the overall population from over 1 million to 600,000. The Kowloon walled city, in which Chinese migrants fled the Chinese Civil War and built a walled settlement within Hong Kong itself, also saw another influx of mainland Chinese citizens. Early employment for these groups was mainly in colonial government offices and manual labor for construction, farming, and naval stockyard operations. This international opening to both immigrant labor and foreign capital paved the way for much of the industrial era and modern developments seen to this day. The first gas plant opened up in 1862, followed by the first electric company founded in 1890, which is now recognized as Hong Kong Electric Company. Hong Kong would continue its rapid industrial development during the second half of the 19th century. Yet, something that would immensely alter everyday life in Hong Kong was beginning to take shape in mainland China. The third plague pandemic, considered one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded human history, was a recurring series of outbreaks of bubonic plague that struck major swaths of China and India, and it was spreading across the continent rapidly. With the influx of Cantonese Chinese immigrants and others from mainland China, as well as the unsanitary working and living conditions that said immigrants would arrive in Hong Kong, the ingredients for an outbreak had culminated together. In 1894, the bubonic plague had arrived in Hong Kong. The outbreak of bubonic plague was lethal to many of those who were infected. According to bacteriologists and historians, the fatality rate would eventually jump to around 90%. Between 1894 and 1929, during the plague's recurring phases in Hong Kong, it would go on to claim around 21,000 lives. The Hong Kong Legislative Council, under the purview of the British colonial government, would do something that would mark a new and grim chapter in its treatment of non-British citizens. In 1904, the council enacted the Peak District Reservation Ordinance, a zoning law that would reserve one of the tallest and arguably one of the wealthiest districts for non-Chinese citizens only, Victoria Peak. The high elevation allowed European residents to tower over the rest of Hong Kong, away from the struggles of the general populace. With this legalized segregation came a new socio-economic division. The higher the elevation someone lived in Hong Kong, the higher their social status was as well. And while parts of Victoria Peak have now opened up for residential housing, it is still widely regarded as an extremely affluent neighborhood. This is but one chapter of Hong Kong's tenuous and oftentimes colonialist relationship with its ethnic minority population. Historians and anthropologists have also alluded to the power imbalances created by the British colonial government, for certain populations that immigrated early on in Hong Kong's history. John Nguyen and Lisa Yukming Leung of Hong Kong University assert as much regarding Britain's preference for Sikh Indians and Gurkhas as their security force on the ground in Hong Kong. Specifically, Nguyen posits that this sort of militarization of ethnic groups against each other helped further isolate these communities from one another. Compounding this with certain groups' already predisposed conservative nature towards preserving their own cultural and religious identities, such as Sikh Indians and practicing Muslim populations, these conditions helped create the grounds for socially enforced segregation. And while this colonial practice did largely cease in the latter half of the 20th century due to the 1997 handover, what remains to this day is a testament to Hong Kong's repeated failures to treat its minority population with the respect and justice they are due. While there have been considerable humanitarian advancements made in the better part of the 20th and 21st centuries through general increased awareness of social and racial prejudice, as well as greater amounts of education and literacy, Hong Kong still, as a whole, struggles in its effort to reconcile with how its minority populations fit in. One prominent issue facing many of those minority populations is healthcare. Many of those community members describe issues ranging from banal to agonizing, such as cultural and language barriers, long wait time in healthcare queues, and having to partake in what is commonly referred to as healthcare tourism. According to a series of interviews conducted by social scientists Sik Li Yung and Hock Bong Koo for the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, of the 25 interviewees sampled in the study, 19 reported having to travel outside of Hong Kong to places such as Singapore, Bangkok, or to India for proper care. Many of those interviewed cited not having adequate interpreters for their language provided, as advertised by the Hong Kong Legislative Council, or, worse yet, instructions not being clear even when delivered in their native tongue, such as on what medications to take, for how long, or other instructions when being at home. The potential for possible catastrophe as a result of these language barriers is largely understated in Hong Kong, and it is one that many healthcare providers and workers are keenly aware of. Many within these communities also have gone on to note a severe stigma regarding social and health mobility during the COVID-19 pandemic. Another similar study conducted in May of 2023 from Hong Kong Polytechnic University found that, again, a vast majority of the selected participants reported a wide array of unpleasant, isolating experiences as a result of the presentation of their identity during the lockdown phases of the pandemic. This discrimination would often go as far as employees asking Pakistani and Nepalese workers to undergo more frequent COVID-19 testing, with one of the participants noting in their interview, all workers who are brown-skinned are instructed to do COVID-19 tests 3 times a week, but this arrangement is for brown-skinned workers only. The Chinese workers do not need to follow this, and they can just get tested in government testing centers once every 2 weeks. Others would note that, on public transit, other passengers would look at these ethnic minority members with such an unpleasant gaze that it would compel them to move seats entirely. Making matters worse, economic mobility is often a pipe dream for many of those Southeast Asian minorities who make their way to the region. According to the Hong Kong 2021 census, of the 448,280 ethnic minority workers employed, around 72% of those jobs were considered elementary occupations, meaning domestic helpers, cleaners, food preparation, delivery, etc. Much of this, according to academics and social scientists such as Lisa Leung Yuk-ming of Lingnan University, attribute this to a variety of entrenched social conditions, such as the regional government's ineptitude in preparing migrant workers for the transition from their own native tongue to speaking in the dominant dialect of Cantonese. Compounding this with the general aversion to Muslim dress and other signifiers of Muslim culture within Hong Kong society, the combination leads to a much higher unemployment rate in comparison to the rest of the population. So much higher that at the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the unemployment rate for all employment-eligible ethnic minorities hovered at about 48.9%. At a time when the government was only doling out $1,200 payments to households to incentivize quarantining and limiting the spread of COVID-19, employment rate would prove to be another great stressor for these communities already facing enough obstacles as is. To recap, here are the key obstacles that many minority communities face in Hong Kong. Number 1. Historic, and in some cases, current segregation. Number 2. Extensive language barriers. Number 3. Extensive employment hurdles. Number 4. Healthcare disparities. Number 5. General societal and cultural prejudice. The solutions and strategies that are about to be advocated for are not entirely comprehensive, nor is there a magic cure-all for every single issue that these communities face. The point of these arguments is to highlight certain actions that organizers, organizations, and individuals are taking to alleviate these very real problems. Perhaps one of the most fundamental obstacles facing ethnic minority communities is the language barrier, as well as the education models for introducing these communities to Cantonese. As discussed earlier, so much of what these communities experience stems from the language barrier. One educational reform that has been gaining traction has been what educational reform advocates have called the cultural responsiveness approach. This approach, as expounded upon by academics and linguists such as Damping Wang of the University of Auckland, seeks to understand where students are actually coming from, what their cultural and socio-economic background is, and design their instructions around that information. After gathering this information on his students, Wang argues that educators and students can more fully realize the inequities that exist outside the classroom for their minority classmates and students, and hopefully act upon that knowledge. Another pitfall within the education system in Hong Kong regarding ethnic minority treatment has been the overall lack of awareness of said issues. While polls conducted within Hong Kong found that around 60% of youths saw ethnic minority treatment and subjugation as problematic, the figure is not as well understood or documented in older populations. And while one shouldn't make sweeping generalizations, given what has already been discussed about the general prejudice that faces ethnic minorities in Hong Kong, these older populations may not see it as something to be severely reckoned with. Luckily, at the University of Hong Kong, there is one instructor who does see it this way. Michael Rivera, the son of a first-generation Filipino-Chinese immigrant family in Hong Kong, has been instructing a new course titled Making Race, dedicated to studying apartheid and other social and racial systems of segregation. In particular, Rivera takes a more global approach to the subject, studying issues such as Islamophobia in the United States and other instances of racialized systems of oppression and discrimination across the world, to bring this issue closer to home for his students. By taking this global perspective, Rivera asserts that these sorts of racial divisions are nothing inherently unique to Hong Kong, and that there are other models for contending with prejudice and discrimination. For educators like Rivera, the point of these discussions is not to instill arbitrary guilt, nor posit the idea that one course will somehow magically fix racism. Rather, these educational initiatives, if taken in greater stride, would go a long way towards easing the taboo centered around this issue. On the employment side, some actions can be taken to mitigate the harm these communities experience. In a study from Lingnan University professor Lisa Leung Yok Ming, she touches on the previously mentioned issue of only Cantonese being represented on job postings, and how that can greatly impact job prospects for those ethnic minority workers. She argues that, on the individual level, employers can take more personal initiative and go the extra mile of advertising job postings in other languages beyond Cantonese. On the government policy level, Yukming asserts that the Labour Department could provide more funding support for ethnic minority job searches, such as internships, translations for advertising materials, and educating employers about the nuances of the language barriers faced by minority job seekers. More than anything, this sort of problem with a scale like this is going to require organizing and greater mobilization of the non-minority populations in Hong Kong. If any progress is seen, activist coalitions and regular citizens need to come together to educate their neighbors, co-workers, colleagues, and anyone receptive to these issues. Ultimately, the issue of language barriers is paramount in providing financial security, higher social mobility, and overall dignity to these communities. Without addressing the issue of language and how it permeates every bit of these communities' existence and navigation of Hong Kong living, there won't be much else able to remedy the problems with healthcare, job placement, housing, and a host of other issues that have been described so far. The solutions and advocacy work we've described range in scope, and without substantial funding and professional help being provided, these inequities will only continue to worsen with time. If Hong Kong wishes to continue as Asia's world city, then it needs to speak to those who have languished for it the longest. 183 years ago, Hong Kong was built on the backs of those immigrants who came from all across Southeast Asia into the city, in an era of expanded trade, a globalizing world, and new opportunities. 183 years later, Hong Kong must do better by these people.